last wrap up of 2024, and it's still January, so sort of still reasonable, though a little bit late, admittedly. I read quite a lot in the last quarter of the year, partly because I had to get through some of my goals, partly because I had deadlines for buddy reads, you know, Discord reads, by which I mean Patreon reads, yeah, and such. And then, you know, it's the holidays, so I want to say I had more time, but I didn't really have more time. I just kind of wanted to read. So yeah, let's talk about the books that I read. If I have them physically, they are stacked next to me. I've learned to not hold up that stack because that did not go well for me last time. I actually did try holding it up, and I was like, nope, let's put it down. Before this goes badly. But I have my trusty Goodreads app. Tell me what I read because I have forgotten. So the very first book I read in quarter 4, so this would have been in September, right? September, October, no, October. October, November, December, that's quarter 4. So in October, I read The Will of the Many by James Islington. And this was on my best books of the year, so you've kind of already heard me talk about it. I read this with my patrons. It was our buddy read, so we had a chat about it. I formerly had read the first book in his first series, so it's on with the orangish cover. Was it what we always say the wrong title in my, well, I think my very first buddy read in my Patreon. If it wasn't the first, it was like the second or maybe third. It was a very, very early Patreon days. We read The Shadow What Was Lost. I think we keep calling it What Was Lost in the Shadows in my Discord. Anyway, that's immaterial. And I hated it. I really, really did not like that book, and I did not read the series. This was getting all the hype and all the praise, and so I thought I'd give it another go, especially because as far as I know, The Shadow What Was Lost was James Islington's debut, so authors can sometimes improve, hopefully do improve. This was getting so much buzz that I was certainly curious to read it, and I really liked this. A lot of the flaws that I found in James Islington's writing, I still found to be true. I don't think he's that good of a writer in terms of his prose or his ability to deliver exposition in a more subtle way. I think it's still quite clunky and amateurish. That being said, I think the premise is an excellent one, and I think a lot of what he's doing with that premise, even though the execution is kind of shaky to me, is still interesting enough for me to forgive that and for me to want to read on in this series. So what I would love is a book like this story, this premise, executed where the prose is perfect, where the exposition is delivered extremely subtly and woven into the story beautifully. I'll take what I can get because it's still really good, but it does go to show that a premise can overcome some structural flaws to your writing. Now, I'm sure there's people that think that his prose is great and his exposition is great. Disagree. But I'm just saying, those things don't have to ultimately break the reading experience entirely if you've got enough other good things going on. So yeah, I think I gave this 4.5 stars or something like that. I might have given it 4.5 and rounded it up to 5 on Goodreads. I don't remember. I guess I could check, but I won't. But it made my favorites of the year. So, you know, it does have my stamp of approval, but with some caveats. So if you find his writing to be clunky and amateurish, it's still clunky and amateurish. It's just a really worthy premise. So I would recommend it. Next up, I read, oh my god, that's way down there. Why is it so far down? The Fellowship of the Ring, and even though I didn't read these, I guess, completely back to back, I nearly read them back to back. Let's do them together. Intermezzo is stuck in there in between, but I basically read these back to back. So after Rings of Power, I think in the span of a week, maybe 2 weeks, I reread the Lord of the Rings trilogy and then read The Hobbit for the first time. I hadn't read it before. So that's this. And I'm actually, I mean, Lord of the Rings is a reread, so like there's not that much to say about it. Like it's Tolkien, it's great. I did a video on should you read Lord of the Rings, so there's that. And then also on Erin's channel, Booked and Busy, she's doing a Middle-earth along or whatever she ended up calling it, something like that. We're doing a read-along of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and so I'll be over there chatting. This might go up after the first chat, but I'll leave it linked regardless if I can. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video talking about Lord of the Rings, because it's Lord of the Rings, but yeah, it's great, and I look forward to discussing it, and if you haven't checked out Andy Serkis's audiobooks, highly recommend, and yeah, Lord of the Rings, good stuff. And then, as just mentioned, in the midst there in my reread of Lord of the Rings, I read Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, which also made my best books of the year, so I talked about it a lot there. I love Sally Rooney, and I know a lot of people don't, but I also know a lot of people do. And I recently read a book, but it's in 2025, so I'll talk about that, I guess, when I wrap up quarter 1 of 2025. But I read it's Irish lit fic, and I was like, oh god, this is awful. And I think my review of on Goodreads was like, is this what people who hate Sally Rooney feel like? Because I feel like if you just did kind of bullet points description of that book and what Sally Rooney's books were like, you'd be like, oh, so like if you like the one, you'd like the other. But no, the devil is in the details, because Sally Rooney's a good writer. I do not like that other book I read. Anyway, so Intermezzo is Sally Rooney's newest, and I pre-ordered like every edition of it and read it pretty much immediately when it came out, and I loved it, and I wept, and it's really, really good. Is it my favorite Sally Rooney? I don't know. I mean, I like them all a lot. My favorite is probably Beautiful World, Where Are You? Or Normal People. I think Normal People is a better book. But I think Beautiful World, Where Are You was like right book at the right time for me. So it just like, it hit really hard for me in the moment that I was reading it. But I think Normal People is probably a better book. This, I don't know, I like them all a lot. I mean, Conversations with Friends, the weakest. And then like three-way tie, I guess, between Beautiful World, Where Are You, Intermezzo, and Normal People. I love them. I think she's just so good at deconstructing the human condition and letting humans be messy and still interesting and reprehensibly sympathetic, sympathetically reprehensible. They're just really human. And I just eat it up. And I look forward to whatever she publishes next. Next up, I read, The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling, which made my worst of the year. This was a Blades and Bodice Rippers book, so surprise, surprise, I didn't like it. This is, in theory, kind of like speculative horror with some romance. And it was just a baffling read. I mean, it was really long. It was needlessly long. So I was really annoyed at having to read the whole thing. And then it was just very, very bad and bafflingly bad. Like, the stuff that the author seems to want you to root for in the book is like, what? What? Do you think this is good? You think this is fine? You think this justifies what these people are doing? Like, are you kidding me? So I had a lot of fun discussing it with the ladies because we felt pretty similarly about it. So it wasn't a case of they all loved it and they're like, oh, Leanna hates it. They didn't really like it either. So that was nice. I felt, not alone in my hatred. Next I read Will Prescribe You a Cat by, oh god, I'm not pronouncing that name. So Will Prescribe You a Cat, I picked it up because, well, I just like saw it around. But Mara had chosen for me when we did a TBR swap a year or two ago, a book called, oh my gosh, what was it called? It was also cat related, because it's Traveling Cat Chronicles, I think. And this looked to me like it would be kind of like that. And I was correct. I mean, the stories were very different, but, or stories, because this is technically a collection of connected stories, I suppose what you say. They're not just connected by theme, like they are connected to each other. Anyway, it's sweet slice of life, heartbreaking, poignant, beautiful, subtle. I really loved it. But if you're not into any of the words I just said, then probably don't read it. But if you are into those words and you're willing to cry, because you will cry, then I really would recommend Will Prescribe You a Cat. Between that and Traveling Cat Chronicles, ooh, which one did I like better? I liked them both a lot. Traveling Cat Chronicles, it was more of a crier. If you're trying to cry less, then read Will Prescribe You a Cat. But both will probably make you cry. Next I read We Solve Murders by Richard Osman. So after reading the Thursday Murder Club, then the internet put in my face, hey, he's got another one coming out. It's another mystery, but it's not part of that. And I was like, okay, well, like I found the other one a bit too twee. This might be more up my alley. I liked this less. I genuinely forget that I read this until every single time when I'm reminded of it, because I look at my Goodreads reading challenge or whatever, and I'm like, oh yeah, I read that book. Totally forgot about that. Or if someone's talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I read that. I mean, at least the Thursday Murder Club books are like, I mean, they're too twee for me, and I have a lot of problems with them, but they're kind of cute, and they have that twee charm about them going for them. This, it's not a very good story, and it's, once again, too many characters. It's kind of a chaotic and weird read, and I really feel like it struggled with tone. The twee tone of Thursday Murder Club, it's not necessarily, like, for me, but it suits the material, and if that's, I think people are reading it for that largely. Here, it's like we still have the aroma of the twee tone in the room. We haven't quite got rid of it, but we're not really doing that. Like this is not a twee book in the same way. So then the lingering odor of tweeness is just really out of place, and I did not like it. I did not like it at all. I really like Richard Osman as a person, like when he's on like panel shows and stuff, but he's just not for me. I don't think I'm going to read anything else by him. Next up, I read a book that made my favorites of the year. And that was Carrie by Stephen King, which took me long enough. I obviously like had heard of Carrie. It had been on multiple October TBRs for me, and I was like, this is the year. I'm freaking doing it. I think it was technically November when I finished it. After all these years, I finally read it, and even though it's well regarded and well known, and it's a classic, and it's been adapted, I was like, it sounds really unpleasant to read. I was like, I'm sure it's good or whatever, but I don't know. I really enjoyed it, which is a weird thing to say because it's a pretty miserable book. But I found it very compelling, and I found Carrie's character really compelling, and I found the structure of the story, which I wasn't aware that's how it would be structured. I thought that added a lot to it. And if I had known it was structured that way, I might not have been so reticent to actually pick it up. Because part of why I didn't pick it up was like, it's just going to be following this narrative, this close third person or first person narrative of this girl being miserable, and that sounds terrible. So it's not really like that. It's not really structured like that. So that kind of helps it from just being this kind of miserable slog. Yeah, I found it really compelling and engrossing, and I was like, damn, like, this is classic for a reason. That was really, really good. So, you know, Stephen King, y'all. I don't know if you heard of him, but the man can write. Next, I read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which also made my best of the year. This is nonfiction, and Ta-Nehisi Coates is just a really good writer, really engaging, really thought-provoking. This book got a lot of buzz because of the interview that he did on a morning show where he was aggressively confronted about the Palestine portion of this book. This book isn't about Palestine, but the book contains a substantial portion about Palestine. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates, as he is wont to do, handled himself very admirably in that interview, and I'm sure he did a lot to boost the sales of his own book. But in general, I recommend reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, and this was a really, I feel like I shouldn't say much more personal, because Between the World and Me is extremely personal. But this was sort of, it was self-reflective and self-critical in a way that his other works haven't been. More of a sort of humbling of himself and unpacking his own biases in a way that previously he was really good at illustrating what biases exist and why you might want to unpack your biases, and he was, right to do so on a lot of points. But here was more sort of turning the spotlight on himself and saying, hey, I'm not perfect either, and I have a lot to examine in my own biases, and the biased nature of writing and journalism, and etc. So I just found it a very thought-provoking read, including the part about Palestine, and I would highly recommend it. Next up, I read A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher, and I really enjoyed this. Not as much as What Moves the Dead. I don't think I'll ever like a T. Kingfisher book as much as What Moves the Dead, but when I started reading it, I was sort of immediately kind of like, oh, I'm into this. Like, I'm looking forward to reading more of this. And it's not that complex a story, and it's pretty short. I think I gave it 4 stars ultimately because the ending of it I didn't really like that much. I didn't hate the ending, it didn't ruin it for me, but it was really good up until kind of like the first 3/4 of it, I would say. I really, really liked it. And then kind of what it did or what it wanted to do or what it wanted to say with the ending, I was like, Again, I didn't hate it, it didn't ruin it, but I was like, eh. So I would still recommend it. It's very, her writing as usual is very sort of evocative and fairy tale-esque, and that worked for me a lot better here than it has in other of her books. So like, I didn't really like The House with the Good Bones. I did not like The Wizard's Defensive Baking, whatever that's called. I did not like that. Have you read other T. Kingfisher? I think I've been advised not to read Nettle and Bone, which is always funny to me. But yeah, so I liked this second most to What Moves the Dead. What Moves the Dead was easy 5 stars. I loved that. This is very good, and I definitely enjoyed it. It's an engrossing read that kept me turning the page, kept me wanting to know what would happen next. It is a fairy tale retelling. I think you don't need to know that. I don't think you need to know which fairy tale it is to enjoy it. In some ways it might be better not to know. But yeah, I mean, I would recommend it. It's not as like a wholehearted, full-chested recommendation as What Moves the Dead. This is more like this, if you're interested and it's on your radar and you have access to it, definitely give it a read. But, yeah. Next, I read A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed, and I initially DNF'd it. Then my friend convinced me to be more charitable in my estimation of it, and was like, I think you're interpreting what it's doing in really bad faith, and she wasn't trying to convince me to un-DNF it. She just likes the book, and was like, I hear what you're saying, and I get why you're saying what you're saying, but I think you're interpreting it in bad faith, and that it's not as bad as you think that it is. So I was like, okay, fine, fair enough. So I'll read it. I'll read the whole thing, and then I'll make up my mind. And by the end, it still rubbed me the wrong way. It's kind of spoilery to say why, but I was like, fine, maybe the author didn't intend it the way that I'm reading it, maybe the author didn't handle it the way that I needed this to be handled in order to not have a problem with it. But maybe she doesn't mean it as, maybe like the author sort of, again, like wasn't as careful with her handling of this situation or how she's writing about this as I needed it to be, but that she's nevertheless like, I'm reading more into it than I need to. So I was like, fine, this is not going to be for me. This is not my favorite thing ever. Fine. I guess I can understand why people like it if they're interpreting it much more positively than I am. Fine. I have since reverted back to my original opinion because of other things that made me retroactively go, no, I was right. I was right to dislike this and to read it the way that I was reading it. And no, I don't like it. I don't recommend it, and I don't recommend Ava Reid. That's all I'm going to say about that. Next, I read One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig, which I read for that Romantasy project. This was my favorite of the Romantasy project, not because it's like an amazing book, but because it was decently enjoyable, and it surprised me with being a Highwayman retelling, and I love the Highwayman, and it was just kind of fun. It wasn't great, but it was fun. And that's, I guess, all I can really ask for in the year of our Lord 2020. Well, it was 2024, but 2025 too. Next I read, oh, I do have this one. Why is it on the bottom? Next I read Slewfoot by Brahm. This was with my patrons, a buddy read. And this is what, unlike Ava Reid, which I was interpreting in bad faith, this I interpreted, or maybe I shouldn't say interpreted. So basically, this book, it's about like the witch trials, but with like a speculative, very speculative story. So a historical fantasy in like the Salem witch trials. And one of my big problems with speculative versions of witch hunts is that oftentimes they kind of try to have their cake and eat it too, because stories about witch hunts are about how innocent women are being persecuted, they didn't do anything wrong, and they're being killed for being a witch. So if you make a story where women are witches, like they actually are doing magic, and then they're being accused of witchcraft and killed for it, I'm not saying you should die because you're doing magic, but like, they're not wrong. They are witches in those stories. Like, you can't do the whole, these insane people accusing these innocent women of witchcraft, these like nutty misogynists. If you do the story where they actually are witches, you're like, no, but like, I mean, patriarchy and evilness aside, they're not wrong. They are witches. So it's like, it's a messier, it's not as a clean of a moral distinction, if that makes sense. Again, I'm not defending killing witches. I mean, unless they are harming people or whatever, but like, yeah, again, I'm not saying it makes them the good guys, the men killing them, but it's less of a clear cut, they're insane and evil. So anyway, this, I felt like walked that line actually really well. I was really impressed how it handled that. The fact that this is a book where witchcraft is real and it's during like Salem witch trials, while still doing the sort of like feminist, they're evil thing and not kind of like losing ground on it that much for various reasons. Now, I do think I was giving it a lot of kind of grace because I have read The Crucible and I have read other stories and have histories about this. If you're not very familiar with the Salem witch trials and the sort of history of that time, and particularly The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which is not, I mean, that's fiction, but, or a fictionalized account. So it kind of assumes, you know, it's kind of in conversation with the existing stories. If you don't know anything about the Salem witch trials, if you've never read The Crucible, this doesn't give you a ton of context. So I would say like that's a weakness of it that I didn't clock because I have read those things. So I just kind of didn't think about how I came to this with existing knowledge that it kind of relied on. Whereas if you didn't have that knowledge, you would be kind of left floundering. So I would say if you are not familiar with those things and you're interested in reading this, then I would definitely at the very least recommend you read The Crucible or watch The Crucible because it's a play before reading this, if you haven't already. But otherwise, I highly recommend it, and it's Brahm, so it has beautiful art in it. So yeah, would recommend. Next was it here? No, I put it away, I think. I read The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, which was for my vlog project. So, that's why I put it away, because I don't normally do them in wrap-ups, but it's the end of the year, so I have, anyway. Watchmaker of Filigree Street, I did it for the, like, reading my 2024 priorities. So if you haven't seen that video, I liked it, with some caveats. There's, like, a part in not the middle, like, towards the end, where I was like, whoa. But ultimately, I had a favorable opinion of it and a good experience with it, and I would read more from Natasha Pulley. Next, I read Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice with my patrons. This was our buddy read. And, oh boy, we had a lot to say about it. A lot to talk about. Some of my patrons are big fans. I love the movie with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and I've watched it many times. And I've heard very good things about the show. I do want to see the show, but I've seen one episode of the show, like when it first came out, but I haven't really watched it. Not because, like, I think it's bad or something. Like I just haven't. But the book, it's not good. It's really not good. And in addition to not being good, because it's not good, it's also very, I don't know, problematic is a word that gets overused, but big yikes. Big yikes. Oh boy. I think even I'm in my Goodreads review, I talked about this, how like there is an element to the story that it's kind of difficult to thread the needle of having this plot point and not have it kind of come off as pedophilic. And I feel like the movie with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt pulls this off with greater subtlety and nuance and threads that needle so much better than the book. The book is big yikes. Oh boy. No, thank you. Next I read The Blue Hour by Paula Hawkins, and I forgot I read that. It's a thriller. It has very good vibes. It's very good, very atmospheric. And then the ending is stupid. The ending, it's not as stupid as that Riley Sager book I read, but it's just like the absolute most predictable ending for this, so it's not a surprising ending. And then it also ends extremely abruptly. So abruptly that you're like, wait, so was there more? Was it not as the super obvious, not interesting ending? Was it actually an interesting ending? I can't tell because it just ended and what? Huh? So yeah, it was, no, I would not recommend that. Not at all. Next I read How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin, and I forgot I read that too. I think it was also recommended to me, or like suggested to me by the internet because I'd read the Osmond books, and the cover is very cute. The title is very eye-catching. I did not really like it either. I feel like the premise itself was sort of the biggest selling point of it, and then I think it really kind of fumbled the premise and then went on too long and just wasn't interesting for itself. It kind of leaned on the clever gimmick of its premise to be interesting, and without actually having an interesting plot or a plot that made too much sense, or with having interesting sympathetic characters. Like, it was just such an empty reading experience. Yeah, it was mostly the premise, and it had very little else to offer. And next I read, the reason you're all here and clicked on this video, The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. And I vlogged it for my patrons, and it's fine. It's better than a lot of other books I've read, better than a lot of other books that I read in 2024, but I think I gave it 3 stars. It's extremely witty. It's extremely, the prose, like this, so the opposite of Will of the Many. Will of the Many, exposition clunky, prose bad, but the premise is so good that I'm like 4.5, 5 stars. The Devils, the prose is immaculate. The wit, sharp. My camera decided to overheat while I was slandering Lord Grimdark. Let's try that again, now that it had some time to cool off. I believe I was saying that The Devils was not that good. That oh yes, the prose, immaculate. The wit, sharper than ever. Could cut, what is people? I feel like there's an analogy, a metaphor for how sharply something can cut. I don't know. Wit sharper than ever though. It's absolutely a delight to watch Joe Abercrombie at his work. Like, he's the best in the biz. But the story, characters, and oh, and that too. As a character writer, like, he still did characterization really well. But again, Will of the Many, characterization, clunky. Exposition, clunky. Prose, quite amateurish and bad. But the plot, the premise is so good that I was absolutely enthralled by it and would want to read more. The Devils, it did everything else right. It has fantastic prose, fantastic characterization, fantastic wit and cleverness in the writing, and the world building too is not half bad. It's pretty good. Arguably more elaborate than First Law. It depends on what metric you want to use to kind of like quantify that, but First Law is much more just kind of basically Europe, but with some names swapped out and a touch of magic. Here, well, you do still, it's if you don't know what The Devils is about at all, hasn't come out yet, I got an arc of it. It is not related to the First Law whatsoever. When Abercrombie was describing it to me, when he was still working on it, I said, so Vatican Suicide Squad, and he was like, yes, Vatican Suicide Squad. Having read it, Vatican Suicide Squad. So the sort of like papalness of it, and the relationship between the church and the general people, and having violent actors working on behalf of the church is very just sort of historically Catholic coded. But there's a lot more magic and speculative stuff going on, a lot more elaborateness as that's concerned. So in that sense, the world building is much more elaborate than First Law. I keep describing it to people as Best Served Cold, or as being most similar to Best Served Cold, because in Best Served Cold, which is one of the First Law standalones, you have a revenge story, and you sort of get the team together. The what we're doing here, the goal is to do the revenge. So you get the cast of miscreants together. They're all a sort of bunch of strange, nefarious folks, and they're all on board to now go and do the mission of the revenge, and then the book is doing the revenge, and then that's the whole book. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but very similar structure then to this Vatican Suicide Squad adventure in The Devils, where we get our squad together, and we have our mission, and then the squad of nefarious individuals that are bound by this purpose go and do the thing. So narratively, like, it's the most reminiscent of that. And some of the characters even do remind me of characters in Best Served Cold. I love Best Served Cold, and I think the reason Best Served Cold works, and this really doesn't, this isn't bad, it's by no means a bad book, it's just very mid, is that, and I also made this comparison in my vlog for my patrons, is that Best Served Cold is more like Deadpool 1, and The Devils is more like Deadpool 3. By which I mean, not just that it's better, but that Deadpool 1, even though there's a lot that's humorous and a lot that is not taking itself very seriously, and a lot that's kind of tongue-in-cheek and darkly humorous, Deadpool 1, there is still this very kind of non-humorous, quite sincerely emotional core. If you haven't seen Deadpool and you don't know what I'm talking about, and maybe you've seen it and you don't like it, I think you would still have to agree with me that even though Deadpool is more of a comical movie, it's not super serious like a lot of superheroes. Deadpool 1, spoilers for Deadpool, Wade Wilson, he gets diagnosed with all of the cancers, just all of the cancers. This is why he makes the rash decision to sign up for this experimental test treatment thing, which ends up making him into Deadpool. And so he's, the fact of him being diagnosed with cancer and him feeling like his life is pretty much over and this is a last attempt at anything, and then becoming Deadpool, while that does cure his cancer, it has other side effects and repercussions in his life, which he's also mad about. So he's not a good person. Wade Wilson is not a good person. It's not like, oh, so tragic, this good person had this terrible thing happen to them. He's a hitman, basically. He's a contract killer. He's not a good person, but he is a person that you kind of root for. He finds love and then gets diagnosed with just all of the cancer. And that's pretty brutal. And the movie doesn't play that for laughs. The movie doesn't really, I mean, they have some humor in it, but it's that humor of like, in real life, a person who gets terrible news will make a joke out of it because they kind of are, that's how they cope with it. And in general, the tone of Deadpool, which is very comedic throughout, is that it's comedic because Deadpool is laughing through his pain, is that he's making jokes in the face of adversity. The fact that he's coping with how upset he is and how bad things are by making jokes about it. And that's why it actually works, and that's why you care about it, and that's why it's actually much funnier. So Best Served Cold is more like that. It has jokes in it. These are not good people, and they're not doing good things, but it's compelling because it's not everything is a joke. Not everything is played for laughs. Not everything is just, oh, these are bad people doing bad things. There are still reasons to root for them and care about them, reasons why they're doing it, serious, emotional, weighty things going on that underpin the sort of crazy antics and violence. The Devils doesn't have that, and neither does Deadpool 3. Deadpool 3, we've forgotten about that, and we've just kind of done the action and the jokes and the craziness. The Devils is like that, so it's still fun. Deadpool 3 is still fun. There's a lot of cleverness. It's an amusing time, but it just doesn't have that sort of emotional weight behind it to make all of this that much funnier and to make you actually care about what's going on. So that's the main thing it's missing for me. I think you wouldn't have to change too much about the Devils to kind of give it that, but it just doesn't have that. And if it doesn't have that key element, the rest of it is just gonna kind of fall flat. For me anyway. A lot of people really liked it. You might be one of those people. I by no means want to dissuade you from ever trying it, but temper your expectations. It's very, like, the writing is quality, the humor, very good, but it just doesn't have the sauce. Okay, so back to it. So when I vlogged this for the Devils for my patrons, I did it in 2 parts because it was really long and I ran out of time. So I did like the first half of the Devils in one vlog, and then the next vlog I did the rest of the Devils and then also the book that I was supposed to do for that month. And it would be kind of funny that I did that. The book that I read that month was Misery by Stephen King. They chose this for me. And so if I didn't really know anything about it when I read it. I did really like this. I considered putting it on my best of the year, but regardless, I really, really liked it. I think Stephen King is an excellent character writer, and that's what's so good about this. Kind of like Carrie, it's like, this is a miserable book in terms of like what's going on, but it's really compelling and engaging. And I was like, I am having so much more fun reading Misery than The Devils. But the reason it's funny also that I read it alongside The Devils is that if you don't know anything about Misery, I guess mild spoilers, but this is kind of the premise of the whole thing. There's functionally 2 characters in Misery. There's technically other people, but there's really just 2 characters in Misery. And they are a writer and a big fan of that writer. And the big fan of that writer has captured, basically, has not kidnapped, because that's not exactly how this ends up happening, but this writer is now like is trapped in the home of this crazy fan, and they are immobile because they are physically injured, and so they're at the mercy of this fan, and the fan has a lot of opinions about this writer's work, obsessed with this writer's work, but also very upset if the writer does the wrong thing with their work. So many a joke about me doing this to Joe Abercrombie to fix the Devils. But that aside, Misery, I think is a very good book. Again, reading it next to The Devils is big. There's just so many characters, so much going on, so much happening, so many steps to this quest. There's just lots happening. And I was kind of bored because I just didn't care. Misery, 2 characters, basically in the same room, definitely in the same house for the whole of this book. So just like the exact opposite. And it's just so much more compelling and engrossing because it's just good character work. It's like a stage play, you know, where like there's not a lot of set changes, not a lot of characters. It's just good storytelling. So I really enjoyed this, and I really like Stephen King. He's written so many books, they can't all be winners, but I do really like Stephen King, and especially when he's focused on character writing and not on speculative stuff. Next, I read The Most Wonderful Crime of the Year by Ali Carter, which made my worst of the year. And I stand by that. Not only is it a book that's not for me, it's also the kind of book where I'm less able to be understanding of how it could be for someone else. Like, I often lean on Sarah J. Maas as an example where, I'm not obsessed with those books, but I understand what it is that people get out of them and why people would be big, big fans of them. This, no. I really hated the romance in this. If you don't know what this is like a cozy mystery / holiday rom-com. And mystery, not really a big part of it. The setting, not really a big part of it. It's mainly the romance, and the romance is very bad. And bad to the point where it made me almost uncomfortable. Definitely, yeah. Anyway, I talked about it more in my worst of the year. If you liked it, I'm happy for you, but no. Ooh! The next book I read also made my best of the year, and this is another example of writing not being that good, but the story overcoming it, and that is The Book of Atris, which is the first Myst book, as in the old 90s computer PC game, which I did try to play as a small child and could not make heads or tails of. And then saw that there were books, convinced some of my patrons to read the first one with me. They thought it was okay. I was so engrossed, so compelled, so swept away by this. The writing is a bit clunky, the pacing is a bit clunky, the characterization is a bit clunky, but I was so attached to the main character and so engrossed in the mystery of what's going on, I couldn't put it down, and I definitely want to read the next ones, and I just devoured this. So if you can get your hands on a copy, I would recommend it, but it's like The Will of the Many, where I'm like, I think it's far from flawless, but it was unputdownable for me. And I don't find that very often. So it did something right. The next book I read was King Nix by Kirsten Backus. And I forgot how I stumbled upon this. And I originally wanted to read it around spooky season. I did start it, I think, in October, but then my library loan ran out, and then I had to get it again later. And this is historical fiction, and I believe it's based on real people. Not just general real people. This is about a specific woman and her husband, and it's sort of like a what if this was true about their backstory. It's kind of feminist historical fiction, and it has a sort of speculative flair to it that is kind of magical realism-ish, I would say. I liked it, but something about it, it just it wasn't one that I kept thinking about or wanting to pick up. Like, I listened to it on the way to and from work slowly, and I didn't really, sometimes, if I've been listening to an audiobook in the car, I'll be desperate to want to continue as soon as I get home, or I'll be really excited to get in the car and continue, or whatever. I was happy to be reading it or listening to it when I was, but it wasn't something that I was super desperate to get back to or to finish. Yeah. I think it's what it's trying to do, it's pretty good at doing it. it just, I don't know, it didn't have this like hook for me where I really super cared about it. It was fine. I didn't really have a problem with anything in it. I was just kind of like, yeah, I mean, this is good. This is good. But like, I'm not like dying to read it or talk about it. It's fine. Anyway, so with that ringing endorsement, you know, maybe you want to read it. It's pretty good. It's definitely not bad. Sounding worse. Okay, the next book I read, I DNF'd this when it came out, and it's not any better. This is not me going, I was so wrong. So you know, in the beginning of 2024, when I binge read and did not like, cannot stress enough, did not like the Once Upon a Broken Heart series by Stephanie Garber, because I like the covers of those books. And I was in a weird place in my life, and I read them. No point did I think they were good. At no point did I think they were bad but fun. People in my comments keep doing this. They're like, it's okay to like bad books. No, you don't understand. I don't like them. I don't think they're fun. I don't think they're poor in quality but still doing something that's fun. I think they're bad. I think they're really, really bad books. I don't think they're compelling or enjoyable or fun or any of those things, but I still read them all. Because something about, I think this is how I phrased it then too, like cosplaying being the kind of person that would read those books is what I enjoyed. I enjoyed imagining that I could be the kind of reader that wouldn't care that this is bad. And that's what I got out of it. I don't think they're good. Not even bad good. Cannot stress this enough. Anyway, so I decided to do this again. And I got the beautiful special re-release hardcovers of the Caraval series, also by Stephanie Garber. And I was like, maybe that magic will strike again, where I hate the books, but I feel like I'm pretending to be the kind of reader that I'm not, and I'm enjoying method acting, being a very different kind of person. So over Christmas, I read Caraval, and it worked. I did it again. I think this is a very bad book, but I enjoyed pretending to be the kind of person that would like it. And I don't know any other way to explain it. I don't think it's good, but this is a stunning, beautiful book. So there's that. It's the fact that the books are pretty and the fact that I can imagine being the kind of person that would like them. Like these new covers are stunning. So I definitely enjoyed the experience of just holding this in my hands when I was reading it. It's not good. It's really not good. But I have the box set. So I will read the other books also. And I'm sure that I will find that they are also not good. Anyway, I can't explain this behavior. Maybe science one day will have the answer. I don't know. Next I read Heroes Die. Oh, do I have it? Yes. Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover. And this I read for my vlog project, the reading priorities for 2024. And I read this because Pierce Brown recommended it, and it's a very unique premise. And it's very obviously something that I thought that Pierce Brown read it after writing Red Rising, like stumbled on it and was recommending it. Having read it, I'm pretty sure he was rereading an old favorite, because there's a lot in here that it's like, oh, Pierce Brown liked this, and he was emulating this. So if you like Red Rising at all, I think it's pretty likely that you'll enjoy at least parts of this. There's elements of the writing style and even the premise of the story that are reminiscent, but it's ultimately an extremely unique premise. I've never read anything quite like it. It's quite complex. It's a bit overwritten, but in a way that I still find enjoyable, and I would recommend it. It drags a tiny bit sort of in the middle because there's kind of so much going on, and it's kind of a lot to keep track of, and it kind of lingers in its melodrama a little bit sometimes. But I ultimately found it a very engrossing, enjoyable, and unique read. So I would recommend this. I can see why Pierce Brown likes this so much. Next, I read my patrons chose for me to read The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. And I talked about this on World Hoppers when we were talking about favorites of the year, because I actually didn't include this on my top books of the year, because I think I made that list before I read this. This was one of the very last books I read. I would not have read this without my patrons making me. The only book I'd ever read by Roshani Chokshi was The Gilded Wolves. I didn't like it, and I had no interest in reading anything more from her. This was fantastic, and I was very uncharitable towards it, because I had not previously liked her books, and this is it's like a YA to adult transition. This is her adult debut, which tend not to go well. It's very sort of flowery, metaphorical, fairy tale, magical realism kind of thing. And I just sort of interpreted everything in bad faith, where I was like, oh, this doesn't mean anything. This is shallow, flourish. You're just doing this to sound flowery. Like, there's nothing to this. And by the end, I was like, I apologize. That was actually really well done. And the stuff I was dismissing the whole time was actually thematically significant and resonant and not just empty flourish, my bad. This is actually fantastic. I do think it starts badly. And I shouldn't say badly, that's an overstatement. There's two perspectives in this book, and you predominantly get in the beginning just the one. I didn't realize there would be another perspective until a little bit into it. The other perspective, the one you do not start with, is by far the better of the two. And I, for a while, was like, do we need the first perspective? Like, why is this even here? Could we not have just had this book be the other perspective? Why? Why do I have to put up with this other perspective? By the end, I was like, okay, I understand why we needed to have this perspective, but then it should have been better because it's your first impression of the book. But ultimately, yeah, this was fantastic. And what it most reminded me of, this I think was chosen for me and has been comped to Starling House, and I love Starling House, but this much more so reminded me of reading a Mona Awad book than that. So I do recommend Starling House. But if you like Mona Awad's writing and this sort of this inability to pin down whether what she's saying is happening or not, then I would highly recommend The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. The second to last book I read, also for the vlog project, was Starsight by Brandon Sanderson, the second in the Skyward series. And I definitely like Skyward better, but I did like Starsight. My major problem with this was that the juvenile tone of it, which is not really different from the juvenile tone of Skyward, it just doesn't work as well anymore for where the story has kind of escalated to. It no longer feels appropriate or forgivable to me to have this sort of more of a juvenile tone to it. But I still enjoyed it, and I think what it was doing, it was still very interesting in what it was doing, even if the execution was a little bit kiddie for me. I definitely want to read the rest of the series, even though everyone's told me it goes downhill after this. But it ends in a way where I certainly am curious to know what happens next. I own them all. So yeah, ultimately a good experience. Again, Skyward better, but this was good. I really liked this. And the last book that I read, is that true? Yes. I don't know why I'm second guessing, and Goodreads is telling me. The last book that I read was the patron buddy read, and that was Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. And I mostly feel very positively about this. I think it's a good book, but I think it suffers from bad pacing and from poor characterization. It's not bad characterization, but people have accused it of a lack of subtlety, which I would mostly agree with. But I think the lack of subtlety is a symptom of the pacing and characterization problems. If the pacing and characterization were fixed, it would then necessarily fix the subtlety problem. I think this should have been a duology. There's a pretty huge revelation in this book that happens quite early on, and we kind of have to rush to get there and then rush through the ramifications of it. And I think if this had been a duology and the end of the first book had been that revelation and the second book was the aftermath, it would have given it the breathing room to tackle these topics in a way that felt more thorough, and it would give it the space to breathe. Here, I think the lack of subtlety somewhat comes from the fact that we're kind of at a breakneck pace to get through this and to get our points across and to make whatever statements we want to make in the short amount of time. And I think if we spread it out a little bit, those points could be made more organically and be shown rather than told. And then also the characterization would flow more naturally because people have to behave in kind of unnatural ways to force this to get through everything that it wants to get through. And then the ending, I have a pitch for how the ending could have been changed. And it would be very, very similar to what we already got. It would be quite a minor change that would also be easier to do if we did a duology because you'd have the space to do it, which would make a huge difference to me in how I feel about how this ends. So it was like so nearly there. This is so good, has so much good stuff in it. But if we just like gave it a little more space, tweaked up the characterization, added in a little bit of these plot elements that I have in mind to kind of fill in the gaps there, this could be perfect. This could be so, so good. So it's good. It could have been great. But I do recommend it if you're interested in it. And a lot of people are not nearly as picky as me. So you might find it to be immaculately perfect just as it is. It's so nearly there for me. So pick it up if you're interested, I say. But yeah. And those are all the books that I read in quarter 4. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Let me know if I've disappointed you or not enticed you, is that the word? If I've piqued your interest in any of them, whatever, let me know. And see you for more bookish videos in 2025. Bye.